The telephone call reached Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's headquarters at 9:30 in the evening on March 22, 1945. The voice on the other end belonged to an operations officer from Army Group G, and it carried news that no one in the German High Command had believed possible. American forces had crossed the Rhine. Not at Mainz, where German intelligence had predicted. Not with the massive preliminary bombardment that characterized every Allied operation. At Oppenheim, a small town 10 miles south, in complete silence. And they had done so unopposed. Kesselring had been Commander-in-Chief West for exactly 12 days. He had taken over from Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt in the wake of the Ardennes disaster, inheriting what one staff officer would later describe as not an army but the broken pieces of one. He was known as Smiling Albert, a nickname that reflected his outward optimism even in the worst situations. But there was nothing to smile about now. The Rhine, Germany's last natural barrier in the west, had been breached. Not by Montgomery's massive set-piece operation in the north, which everyone knew was coming, but by George Patton, the one American commander the Germans had learned to fear most. Kesselring read the initial reports in silence. Elements of the United States 5th Infantry Division had begun crossing the river at 22:30 hours. Assault boats. No artillery preparation. The opposite bank, defended by what remained of the German 7th Army, had offered minimal resistance. By midnight, the Americans had ferried 600 men across. By dawn, they would have thousands. Within 48 hours, 4 American divisions would establish a bridgehead deep enough to support a breakout into the heart of Germany. The Field Marshal's staff assembled around the map table. The situation was worse than the fragmentary reports suggested. German forces west of the Rhine had been systematically destroyed throughout March. Hitler's order to defend every inch of ground, to hold the line no matter the cost, had accomplished exactly what Kesselring and every rational officer had predicted. It had trapped hundreds of thousands of German soldiers on the wrong side of the river, where they were either killed or captured. Over 68,000 in 5 days alone during Patton's drive through the Saarpalatinate. 300,000 total in the month of March. This was the landscape of a collapsing front. If you want to understand what was happening inside Hitler's command structure as Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine, join thousands who support this channel by subscribing for more long-form World War II documentaries. This crossing represented not just a tactical defeat but the visible confirmation of something German generals had known privately for months, and they would now have to face the reality that their war was lost. The forces available to contest Patton's crossing were negligible. The German First Army and Seventh Army, which nominally defended the southern Rhine, existed primarily on paper. Their divisions were divisions in name only. Volksgrenadier units filled with men over 50 and boys under 18. A handful of tanks with no fuel. Artillery pieces with no ammunition. These were not the forces that had conquered France in 1940 or driven to the gates of Moscow in 1941. These were the remnants of what Field Marshal Kesselring himself would later describe as trying to play a Beethoven sonata on an old, rickety, out-of-tune piano. But the strategic implications went beyond the immediate tactical situation. Kesselring understood military history. He understood that rivers are natural defense lines only when you have the forces to defend them properly. The Rhine at Oppenheim was approximately 900 feet wide. Swift current. Deep water. Under normal circumstances, a well-defended crossing site that any competent commander could hold. But there were no normal circumstances anymore. There were no reserves to commit. No reinforcements to send. No counterattack to launch. The Americans, by contrast, were at the peak of their power. Patton's Third Army alone consisted of 12 divisions and over 320,000 men. His army group commander, Omar Bradley, controlled twice that number. The material disparity was even more pronounced. American trucks moved supplies forward in endless convoys. American artillery could saturate any target with thousands of shells. American aircraft owned the sky. And American engineers, working with a speed and efficiency that German observers found almost incomprehensible, could throw a pontoon bridge across the Rhine in less than 24 hours. That contrast defined everything. When Zhukov had prepared to defend Leningrad in 1941, he had at least possessed the possibility of success, however slim. When Kesselring looked at the Rhine crossing at Oppenheim, he possessed no such possibility. The outcome was predetermined. The only questions were how long German forces could delay the inevitable, and how many lives would be wasted in the attempt. The reports from Oppenheim continued through the night. The Americans had not been opposed. The Germans had not even known they were crossing until the assault boats were already returning for a second load. A few artillery shells fell near the crossing site hours later, ineffective and poorly aimed. The Luftwaffe, which Hitler still believed could contest the skies if properly committed, managed no response at all. There were no planes. Or rather, there were planes, but no fuel to fly them. No pilots left alive who could fly them effectively. No airfields within range that had not been bombed into unusable rubble. By dawn on March 23, Kesselring knew the situation was irretrievable. Not because Oppenheim itself mattered strategically. It was simply one more crossing site among several. The Americans had already crossed at Remagen 2 weeks earlier. Montgomery would cross in the north within hours. But Oppenheim mattered psychologically. It demonstrated with brutal clarity that German forces could no longer defend even the most basic natural obstacles. That American commanders could cross major rivers on the run, without preparation, almost casually. That the Wehrmacht, which 4 years earlier had been the most formidable military force on Earth, could now be brushed aside by a single American division conducting a night assault. Kesselring drafted his initial assessment for the High Command. He chose his words carefully. Hitler did not tolerate defeatism, and several generals had been relieved, or worse, for telling the Führer truths he did not want to hear. But the Field Marshal was a realist. He had spent the previous year conducting a brilliant defensive campaign in Italy, trading space for time, making the Allies pay for every mile. He understood better than most how to delay a superior enemy. But he also understood when delay was no longer possible. When the only rational option was withdrawal to positions that could actually be defended. The response from Berlin came within hours. Hitler ordered the bridgehead at Oppenheim to be destroyed. Immediate counterattack. Commit all available reserves. The Americans must not be allowed to expand their foothold. Standard instructions that might have made sense if there were any reserves to commit. But there were no reserves. There was nothing. The German forces that could have mounted such a counterattack had ceased to exist weeks ago, destroyed in the Rhineland fighting or surrendered west of the river. Kesselring did what he could. He ordered local commanders to scrape together whatever forces remained and attack the bridgehead. Artillery fire was directed at the crossing site. A few tanks from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division were sent south, though they had no fuel for sustained operations and would likely be destroyed before they accomplished anything. These were gestures, and everyone knew it. Gestures meant to demonstrate compliance with orders from Berlin, not actual military operations with any hope of success. The Field Marshal's headquarters monitored the situation throughout March 23. The American bridgehead expanded steadily. 5,000 men across by morning. 10,000 by midday. 15,000 by evening. The engineers had brought forward Navy landing craft, LCVPs and LCMs, the same vessels that had carried troops ashore on D-Day. These could move men and equipment far faster than the Germans could react. By the evening of March 24, American forces had constructed a pontoon bridge. Vehicles began crossing. Tanks, artillery, supply trucks. The thin German defensive line, already undermanned and undersupplied, simply dissolved. What German commanders said to each other in private during these hours is not extensively recorded. The Third Reich did not encourage its officers to document their doubts or criticisms. But we know from post-war testimonies and interrogations what they thought. They thought the war was lost. They thought continuing to fight was pointless. They thought Hitler's refusal to permit withdrawal or surrender was condemning hundreds of thousands of German soldiers to death or captivity for no strategic purpose. They thought, in short, exactly what rational military professionals would think when confronted with an impossible situation. But they continued to obey. Some from fear. The SS and Gestapo did not tolerate defeatism, and summary executions for refusing orders had become routine. Some from misguided loyalty to Hitler, who had led them to such spectacular victories earlier in the war that even now, With Germany collapsing, they could not bring themselves to question his judgment. Some from simple momentum, the ingrained habit of following orders that had been drilled into them throughout their military careers. And some from the calculation that surrender to the Western Allies was preferable to what would happen if they were overrun by Soviet forces in the East. This last consideration shaped much of German strategy in the final weeks of the war. Kesselring and other commanders in the West conducted delaying actions, not to prevent Allied victory, but to buy time. Time to move as many soldiers and civilians as possible westward, away from the advancing Red Army. Time to negotiate better surrender terms. Time to hope, however irrationally, that some political development might save Germany from unconditional surrender. None of this was based on realistic military assessment. The German armed forces were finished. But it provided a rationale for continuing to resist even when resistance had become militarily futile. The crossing at Oppenheim was complete by March 26. The Americans had suffered minimal casualties. A few dozen wounded, mostly from scattered artillery fire. The Germans had lost several thousand men, killed or captured, and gained nothing. The bridgehead was secure. The way into central Germany lay open. Patton's divisions would advance rapidly east, liberating concentration camps, capturing hundreds of thousands more prisoners, driving toward Czechoslovakia and Austria. Within 6 weeks, the war would be over. But on the night of March 22, when that telephone call reached Kesselring's headquarters, the field marshal could not have known the exact timeline. What he knew was simpler and more terrible. The Americans had crossed the Rhine. They had done so without serious opposition. And there was nothing he could do to stop what would follow. That knowledge, more than any particular words he may have spoken or orders he may have issued, was what defined the German High Command's reaction to Patton's crossing. Not panic. Not anger. Just the cold recognition of defeat, and the bitter task of managing that defeat as it unfolded. The strategic situation by late March 1945 left no room for doubt about the war's outcome. In the east, Soviet forces stood on the Oder River, less than 40 miles from Berlin. They had overrun Poland, East Prussia, and much of eastern Germany. Their armies numbered in the millions, backed by thousands of tanks and aircraft. In the west, Allied forces had crossed the Rhine at multiple points and were advancing with a speed that German defenders found impossible to counter. In Italy, German forces were retreating north toward the Alps, pressed by American and British divisions. The Third Reich was being crushed from all directions simultaneously. Hitler, in his underground bunker in Berlin, refused to acknowledge this reality. He continued to issue orders for counteroffensives that could not be executed, to demand that positions be held that could not be defended, to speak of miracle weapons and political developments that would turn the tide. His generals, who could see the actual situation, found themselves trapped between their oaths of loyalty and the increasingly obvious futility of continued resistance. Some, like Kesselring, tried to interpret Hitler's orders in ways that minimized casualties and destruction. Others simply followed instructions, no matter how irrational, because they could not bring themselves to do otherwise. The crossing at Oppenheim fit into this larger pattern of collapse. It was not the first American crossing of the Rhine. Remagen had come 2 weeks earlier. It would not be the last. The 7th Army would cross near Worms a few days later. But it was the crossing that demonstrated most clearly how thoroughly German defensive capabilities had deteriorated. Patton had gambled that German forces would be too weak and disorganized to oppose a surprise crossing, and he had been proven completely correct. The Wehrmacht, which had once struck terror into its enemies, could now be defeated by a single division crossing a major river at night. Kesselring's staff worked through the night to assess the damage and coordinate whatever response was possible. Phone lines to subordinate commands were frequently cut by Allied bombing or artillery. Reports came in slowly and often contradictory. What was clear was that American forces were expanding their bridgehead faster than German forces could react. What was also clear was that this pattern would continue. The material and numerical superiority of the Allies was so overwhelming that German forces could not mount effective resistance for more than brief periods before being overwhelmed or forced to withdraw. The Field Marshal had commanded German forces in some of the most difficult defensive operations of the war. In Italy, He had conducted a masterful fighting withdrawal that had delayed Allied forces for months. But Italy had offered defensible terrain. Mountains, rivers, fortified positions. And even with all those advantages, the outcome had been inevitable. Now, defending the open plains of Western Germany against enemies with unlimited resources and complete air superiority, there were no clever tactical maneuvers that could change the fundamental reality. Germany had lost the war. The only question was how long it would take for that loss to be formalized through surrender. What makes the Rhine crossing at Oppenheim particularly significant in understanding the German collapse is not just the tactical details but what it revealed about the state of German command and control by late March 1945. Before diving deeper into the profound implications of Patton's success, please support our channel's mission to bring you these detailed historical narratives by subscribing and turning on notifications for more documentary content like this. The German military had entered the war with one of the most sophisticated command systems in the world. The General Stab, the General Staff, represented generations of accumulated military expertise. German officers were trained to think independently, to use initiative, to adapt to changing circumstances. Mission-type orders, Auftragstaktik, gave subordinate commanders freedom to achieve objectives using their own judgment. This system had served Germany well in both world wars, allowing relatively small forces to achieve disproportionate results through superior tactics and leadership. By March 1945, that system had broken down completely. Hitler had centralized all major decisions in his own hands. Generals who showed initiative were relieved. Officers who questioned orders were removed or worse. The command structure that had once been flexible and responsive had become rigid and paralyzed. When Patton crossed at Oppenheim, the German response was not delayed because of communication problems or because commanders on the scene lacked resources. It was delayed because no one dared to act without explicit authorization from above, and authorization from above could not come because Hitler refused to believe what was happening. The disconnect between reality at the front and perception in Berlin had become total. Kesselring could see that his forces were being systematically destroyed. His subordinate commanders sent reports daily detailing the deteriorating situation. Divisions that existed on paper had ceased to exist in fact. Units marked on situation maps as holding defensive positions had actually been overrun days earlier, or had dissolved as their soldiers deserted or surrendered. The entire apparatus of military reporting had become a fiction, maintained because telling the truth was too dangerous. This was not unique to the Western Front. The same pattern prevailed everywhere. In Italy, commanders reported defensive lines that had already been abandoned. On the Eastern Front, Soviet advances were minimized in official reports while phantom German divisions were shown conducting counterattacks that never occurred. The high command briefings that Hitler attended each day presented a version of the war that bore increasingly little resemblance to what was actually happening. And because Hitler made all significant decisions based on these briefings, those decisions were disconnected from reality. The result was catastrophic. When Patton crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim, the rational response would have been immediate withdrawal of all German forces from defensive positions that could no longer be held, consolidation of remaining strength into a coherent defensive line further east, and negotiation of surrender terms before more lives were wasted. None of this happened. Instead, Hitler ordered the impossible. Kesselring issued orders he knew could not be executed. Subordinate commanders tried to obey while knowing their efforts were futile. And thousands of German soldiers died or were captured in the resulting chaos. The human cost of this dysfunction was staggering. In March alone, over 350,000 German soldiers surrendered on the Western Front. These were not all casualties of combat. Many were simply bypassed by advancing American columns, cut off from supply and communication, and left with no choice but to raise white flags when American forces circled back to collect them. Others continued fighting in isolated pockets for days after the front had moved past them, unaware that they had been abandoned. Still others attempted to retreat east but found roads clogged with refugees and rear area units, all fleeing in the same direction. The American advance after the Rhine crossings moved with a speed that German defenders found impossible to counter. Patton's armored divisions could cover 50 miles in a single day when roads were open and resistance light. German units attempting to form defensive lines found themselves outflanked before they could dig in. American tactical air power interdicted any movement during daylight hours. And American artillery, coordinated with frightening efficiency, could bring overwhelming firepower to bear on any concentration of German forces within minutes. This was the new reality of warfare, and it bore little resemblance to what German officers had been trained to expect. The Wehrmacht in 1939 and 1940 had pioneered the concepts of mobile warfare, combined arms operations, and deep penetration by armored forces. Now those same concepts were being used against Germany with a scale and intensity that German forces could not match. The student had become the master, and the master had been reduced to trying to fight a modern war with obsolete methods and inadequate resources. Kesselring understood this better than most. He had served in the Luftwaffe before taking ground commands, and he had seen firsthand how air superiority shaped ground operations. Without control of the air, defensive positions became death traps. Supply convoys could not move during daylight. Reinforcements could not be brought forward without being bombed and strafed. Even communication between units became difficult when radio messages could be intercepted and command posts could be bombed. The Allies had enjoyed air superiority since 1944, and by March 1945 that superiority was so complete that German forces operated under constant threat from above. The psychological impact of this constant threat cannot be overstated. German soldiers who had survived years of combat described the final months of the war as the most terrifying, not because the fighting was more intense but because there was no safety anywhere. Artillery could strike without warning. Aircraft could appear overhead and destroy entire columns before anyone could take cover. American forces seemed to have unlimited ammunition and used it lavishly. The material disparity had become so overwhelming that combat felt less like warfare and more like execution. Yet German forces continued to fight. Some units maintained discipline and cohesion almost to the end. Others dissolved into chaos, with soldiers deserting individually or in small groups. The variation reflected local circumstances and leadership quality. Units with respected commanders who could explain the situation honestly and make rational tactical decisions often performed better than units whose commanders simply repeated Hitler's impossible orders without adaptation. But even the best-led units could only delay, not prevent, the Allied advance. The crossing at Oppenheim became complete by the end of March. American engineers had constructed multiple bridges across the Rhine. Traffic moved freely between the west and east banks. The bridgehead extended deep enough that German artillery, even if any had been available in quantity, could no longer threaten the crossing sites. Patton's army group had established a secure lodgment in central Germany and was preparing to advance further east. The Rhine barrier, which Hitler had insisted would hold the Allies for months, had been breached in multiple places within weeks. Kesselring's response to this disaster was pragmatic. He shifted what forces he could to delay the American advance, buying time for civilians to evacuate and for remaining military units to retreat in some semblance of order. He did not waste resources on futile counterattacks. He did not issue orders that he knew could not be executed. Within the constraints imposed by Hitler's increasingly irrational directives from Berlin, he tried to minimize casualties and destruction. This made him unusual among senior German commanders in the final weeks of the war, when many simply repeated Hitler's orders without regard for consequences. The pattern established at Oppenheim repeated across the entire Western Front. American forces crossed the Rhine at multiple points. British and Canadian forces crossed in the north. French forces crossed in the south. Everywhere the story was the same. Overwhelming Allied strength meeting minimal German resistance, followed by rapid advances into German territory. The Wehrmacht's fighting power had simply evaporated. Divisions that had once been formidable were now shadows. Equipment that had once been superior was now destroyed, captured, or abandoned for lack of fuel. The military machine that had conquered most of Europe in less than 2 years could no longer defend even its own heartland. Hitler's reaction to the Rhine crossings provides insight into his state of mind by late March 1945. He blamed the generals for not following his orders strictly enough. He blamed the soldiers for lacking the will to fight. He blamed traitors and defeatists who, he claimed, were undermining the war effort. What he did not do was acknowledge that the strategic situation was hopeless, that Germany lacked the resources to continue effective resistance, or that surrender was the only rational option. His last orders to forces in the West called for fanatic resistance, scorched earth policies, and summary execution of anyone showing defeatist tendencies. These were the orders of a man completely detached from reality. Kesselring and other senior commanders faced an impossible situation. They could obey Hitler's orders literally and watch their remaining forces be destroyed for no purpose. Or they could interpret those orders flexibly, trying to save what could be saved, and risk being relieved or shot as defeatists. Most chose some middle path, outwardly complying while quietly minimizing the damage. A few refused and were removed from command. And a very few, seeing no other option, began exploring surrender possibilities without authorization from Berlin. The Ruhr Pocket, which formed in early April as American forces encircled Army Group B, illustrated this dynamic perfectly. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding the trapped German forces, received orders from Hitler to hold the Ruhr at all costs. The industrial region supposedly represented Germany's last hope for continued production of war materials. In reality, the factories had been bombed into ruins and lacked raw materials. But Hitler insisted the pocket be defended. Model knew this was impossible. His forces numbered over 300,000 men on paper, but most were Ruhr area troops, administrative personnel, or Volkssturm militia with minimal combat capability. He had little ammunition, less fuel, and no hope of reinforcement or resupply. Model fought a delaying action for 2 weeks, buying time for as many soldiers as possible to escape the encirclement. Then, on April 15th, he dissolved his army group and released his remaining forces from their military obligations, telling them to go home. He refused to surrender personally, considering it dishonorable for a German field marshal. Instead, he walked into a forest and shot himself. His suicide exemplified the impossible position German commanders found themselves in. They knew the war was lost. They knew continued resistance was futile. But they had been conditioned by decades of military service to obey, to persevere, to never admit defeat. Breaking that conditioning required something most could not manage. The American forces that accepted the surrender of the Ruhr Pocket were struck by what they found. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, many of them boys or elderly men, surrendering without fight. Vast quantities of equipment, most of it immobile for lack of fuel or in disrepair. And a population that seemed more relieved than anything else that the fighting was over. The contrast with the fanatical resistance that Nazi propaganda had promised could not have been more stark. Germany was not fighting to the last man. It was collapsing under the weight of its own exhaustion and defeat. Elsewhere, the story continued much the same. American forces advanced rapidly through western and southern Germany. British and Canadian forces moved northeast toward Hamburg and Denmark. French forces drove toward the Swiss border. Resistance varied from fierce to non-existent depending on local circumstances, but the overall trend was unmistakable. German forces were being systematically destroyed or captured. The end was approaching rapidly. Kesselring's last act as Commander-in-Chief West came in early May. With Soviet forces in Berlin and Hitler dead by suicide, the new German head of state, Admiral Karl Donitz, authorized surrender negotiations. Kesselring, now commanding what remained of German forces in southern Germany, met with American commanders and arranged the capitulation. Unlike Model, he survived. He would later be tried for war crimes related to his command in Italy and sentenced to death. A sentence later commuted to life imprisonment before being released in 1952 due to health concerns. What had Kesselring and other German generals said when they realized Patton had already crossed the Rhine? The surviving records provide few direct quotations. German military communications by that stage were terse and factual, focused on immediate tactical necessities rather than strategic assessment. Personal diaries and memoirs written later are often self-serving, minimizing the writer's role in the regime's crimes or presenting a more rational picture than the chaotic reality. But from the pattern of their actions, from the decisions they made and the orders they issued, we can reconstruct their thinking with reasonable accuracy. They knew the war was lost. They had known since at least the failure of the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, and many had suspected much earlier. They knew that continued resistance would accomplish nothing except prolonging the suffering. They knew that Hitler's orders were increasingly disconnected from military reality. They knew that obedience to those orders meant sending men to die for no strategic purpose. And they knew that the only rational course was surrender, the sooner the better, to minimize further casualties and destruction. But they continued to obey. They issued the orders, managed the retreat, tried to maintain some semblance of military discipline even as their forces disintegrated. They did this partly from ingrained habit, partly from fear of the consequences of disobedience, partly from misplaced loyalty to a regime that had led them to catastrophe. They did this knowing it was futile, knowing history would judge them harshly, knowing they were complicit in prolonging a war that should have ended months earlier. They did this because they were products of a system that valued obedience above judgment, loyalty above morality, and duty above humanity. The Rhine crossing at Oppenheim, in this context, represented just one more step in Germany's descent into final defeat. It was not the first disaster and it would not be the last. But it demonstrated with unmistakable clarity what German generals already knew and what they could no longer avoid acknowledging even to themselves. The Wehrmacht was finished. The Third Reich was finished. And no amount of fanatic determination or miracle weapons or political developments would change that fundamental reality. All that remained was managing the collapse, trying to save what could be saved, and hoping that surrender would come before everything was destroyed. When Patton's forces established their bridgehead at Oppenheim, they did not trigger this realization. They simply confirmed it. The American commander had gambled that German defenses were too weak to oppose a surprise crossing, and the complete success of that gamble proved him correct. German forces could no longer defend major river lines. They could no longer mount effective counterattacks. They could no longer prevent Allied forces from advancing wherever they chose to advance. The material and psychological collapse was complete. This was not the story German propaganda told. Radio broadcasts continued to promise ultimate victory, to describe phantom divisions counterattacking, to claim that the Allies were being bled white and would soon sue for peace. These lies fooled no one who had access to actual information about the military situation. They may have provided some comfort to civilians in areas not yet overrun, who desperately wanted to believe that the suffering would end with German victory rather than German defeat. But among the military leadership, such propaganda had long since lost any credibility. So when that telephone call reached Kesselring's headquarters on the evening of March 22nd, informing him that Americans had crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim, the field marshal's response was probably not surprise, not outrage, not even particular concern. It was simply acknowledgement. Another position lost. Another river line breached. Another step closer to the inevitable end. He issued whatever orders were appropriate under the circumstances, knowing they would accomplish little, knowing the Americans would expand their bridgehead regardless, knowing that within weeks the war would be over. And in that knowledge, in that quiet acceptance of defeat despite the continued requirement to fight on, lay the real answer to the question of what German generals said when they realized Patton had crossed the Rhine. They said very little. They issued orders. They filed reports. They tried to maintain some control over events that had spiraled far beyond their ability to influence. But the words that mattered, the recognition that shaped all their subsequent actions, were never spoken aloud. They were simply understood. The war that Germany had started in 1939 with such confidence, that had seemed so close to total victory in 1941, had ended in complete defeat. The military that had conquered Poland in weeks, France in months, and driven deep into the Soviet Union, had been systematically destroyed on all fronts. The regime that had promised a 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years and left Germany occupied, divided, and facing a reckoning with the crimes it had committed. Patton's crossing at Oppenheim was simply one small piece of this larger catastrophe, notable mainly for demonstrating how completely German military power had collapsed by the spring of 1945. The American Third Army would continue east, eventually linking up with Soviet forces and participating in the occupation of Germany. The war in Europe would end less than 6 weeks after that night crossing, with German surrender and Hitler's suicide. The Rhine barrier, which was supposed to protect Germany from invasion, had been crossed and forgotten within days. For the German generals who watched this unfold, who knew what it meant and what would follow, the experience was not dramatically different from what their counterparts in other defeated nations had experienced throughout history. The recognition of inevitable defeat. The requirement to continue fighting anyway. The growing disconnect between orders received and reality observed. The knowledge that each day of continued resistance meant more deaths for no purpose. All of this had happened before, would happen again, was simply the common fate of military leadership on the losing side of any war. What made it distinctive was the nature of the regime they served and the scale of the destruction that regime had unleashed. German generals in 1945 were not simply losing a war. They were complicit in a regime that had started that war with deliberate aggression, that had conducted that war with systematic atrocities, and that was now dragging Germany down into a defeat far more total than any military loss required. Their obedience to Hitler's irrational orders in the final weeks prolonged that agony and added unnecessarily to the casualty count. History has rightly judged them for these choices. But on that night in March 1945, when the telephone rang and the voice reported that Americans had crossed the Rhine unopposed, what Kesselring and the German High Command recognized was simpler and more immediate than questions of historical judgment or moral responsibility. They recognized that the war was lost, that the end was coming rapidly, and that there was nothing they could do to prevent it. That recognition, more than any particular words spoken or orders issued, was the German general's true reaction to Patton's crossing of the Rhine. And if you found this deep dive into one of the final chapters of the war in Europe valuable, please consider subscribing for more long-form historical content exploring the human stories and strategic realities behind the major events of World War II.